All right, guys. So to implement our next project, we are going to start off by creating a project. Of course, let's navigate to our desktop. So right here on the desktop, we're going to create our project called URL Shortener, and we're going to be using Poetry to add the following dependencies: FastAPI, UVCon, Sqlite, and the short UUID. Let's proceed to add this set of dependencies. All right, so once we have these dependencies added, let's proceed to open up this project with VS Code. Okay, so I'm going to simply open with VS Code just like this. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do would be to create a config file inside our URL shortener folder. So let's have a config.py. So we're going to be setting up our base configuration for Pydantic, which would basically point to our base URL as well as our database URL. And next, we're going to simply set up our database in the database.py file. So let's create a new file here called database.py. In here, I'm going to be putting the database configuration right here, where we specify the engine. And of course, we'll also get to import our settings, which is what we have created within the config file already right here. So next, we're going to create our model file. Within the model file, we're simply going to put in our database table, which is going to be referenced as a Sqlite class. So we have the base class here, and we have this set of columns that should be in our table. The name of our table is going to be called URLs. Okay, so we're also going to create a schema file. So let's create a schema.py file, and within the schema.py file, we're simply going to set our Pydantic object shape just like this: the URL base, the URL itself, as well as our config. So now we can proceed to create the main.py file. Now within the main.py file, we're simply going to have our FastAPI configuration as well as import our database configuration. So let's go ahead to put that first. And next, we are going to be setting up our controllers and the routes. The first controller we have is simply for creating the short URL and saving that record into our database right here. And the second controller we have is simply for clients to make their request with a short UID, and then we'll basically redirect them to the original URL. So that is it. All right, so now that we have this function, the next thing we're going to do is to simply create a function here that will be used to start our application. So within the main file, we simply have a def start. The start function here would be used to start our UVCon. So I'm simply going to import UVCon, after which I would simply say uvcon.run. So here I can specify our URL shortener, and I can simply specify the main file and our app instance that we need to run. I can also specify the host, which is simply 0.0.0.0, which happens to be our local host. And I would also specify the port. I want to go with port 8000, and I would simply set reload to true. Okay, so with this set, I would also go to the terminal file, and I would simply create a script which says URL shortener main start. Okay, so let's pull up our terminal, and I can simply say Poetry install first, just to ensure we have our virtual environment activated here. Okay, so next I am going to say Poetry run start. All right, so this would run our application, but as you can see, we have an error. So it says module not found, Pydantic settings, and that is correct. Let's proceed to install that. So to install that, we're simply going to say Poetry add Pydantic settings. All right, so we've added that package. Let's go ahead and run our application one more time. All right, so when I try to run this, I see we have an error, and I can see that error is coming from a simple mistake we made in our file naming. So let's fix that. So we have models, and we also have schemas right here. So let's make sure we name our files correctly. So with that done, I would simply run our project again. So Poetry run start. All right, so now we have our application running. So we can allow this so that we can basically test our application. All right, so I'm simply going to pull up Postman. You can use any HTTP client you're comfortable with. All right, so I have Postman opened up here. Let's go ahead and create a new collection. I'm simply going to call this URL Shortener collection. So yeah, we can have URL Shortener collection. Okay, and within this collection I can add my first request. My first request is going to be a post request because I have to send this request to our server. So let's select posts, and I'm simply going to say HTTP with localhost, or you can simply use the 0.0.0.0 and you have 8,000, just like we've set before. I'm going to send this request while including our JSON body of a target URL. So let's go down to body section. Let us select raw, and we have JSON selected already. So I'm just going to include the targets right here, and we have our example, which is example.com. I can change this to something else, maybe solomonmarvel.com. All right, so when I send this, we expect to get a response from our application. It says detail not found, so let's try to verify where that error is coming from. Let's go back to our application. We see we have this running on port 8000. Oh, right. So I actually forgot to include the endpoint right here. So the endpoint is simply URL. So when I send this request, we have the target URL, and we also have the short URL, and we also included the created at option here. So if we go back to our file, we can simply see our Shortener DB. We can basically install packages for accessing the Sqlite data. So I can simply type in Sqlite here. All right, so we have SQL tools installed. Let's also install SQLite viewer, right? So I think, yeah, that would basically be a good tool that we can use. If you don't have this installed, you can go ahead and install that. All right, let's come back to our application here. Let's click on Shortener DB. All right, when I click on this, you see the record we just created is found, in our table. Okay, in order to get, the short URL, when we are making the next request, by the way, we can save this. Let's call the name of this request create short URL. So the next request we're going to create here would be a get request. Okay, so the get request is simply going to help us get the original URL and basically route us there. So if I go down to the main.py file, you see we have app.get with the URL ID. Okay, so the URL ID is quite important. And what exactly is that URL ID? If we go back to the Shortener DB, you see we have an ID right here. This is the short ID that was created for us. When we are sending the next request, we simply have to say 0.0/8000, and we have to include that column 8000. We have to include that specific ID because that is what the backend, which is our Python application, would use to determine the long URL that we will be routed to. Okay, so now let's simply make that request, and you see it gives us the long URL that we can simply route to. All right, so this is our simple URL Shortener application, basically using Poetry. So that's the main focus of the project. So thanks for watching. I believe with that, you basically have the fundamental knowledge to use Poetry for your next application. Thank you.